Lecture, we're going to talk about epidemiology and the impact of legalization. What is epidemiology? Epidemiology is the study of the prevalence and determinants of health and disease conditions in defined populations. And so as we move through the different modules, we're going to be talking about, in each one, the epidemiology of the given disorder. So when it comes to chronic pain, we'll talk about epidemiology of chronic pain. When we get to PTSD, we'll talk about that. In any case, it's ideal for assessing patterns at the population level. And here we're interested more broadly in, has cannabis use increased since legalization? So specifically, what is the epidemiology of cannabis use, and has that changed since legalization? So we have various tools at our disposal. One is called the Monitoring the Future study, which is a long-term epidemiological study. It's been going on since 1975 on the trends in drug use and attitudes among U.S. adolescents and adults. In this survey, 50,000 adolescents across 400 schools complete it every year. It assesses personal use, perceived risk of use, and disapproval of use. So what does this survey tell us about what has changed since legalization? Well, so here we look at the adults on the left side of the screen here. And this is the 2017 survey. What we see, going way back to the early 80s, is dropping prevalence of cannabis use among full-time college students, 12th graders, and others, until in the low 1990s, 92 or so. Then we see a spike back up a little bit, then holding a little bit steady, really pretty steady. And then what we see beginning after legalization with some of the states, Colorado and Washington, what we see is basically 12th graders staying pretty steady. Those are the blue triangles. We see recently a bit of an uptick in 2015-16 in terms of college students. And then the other group here too, a bit of an uptick in the last 3 years. But let's look at adolescents. When we look at adolescents, we look at 12th graders since 75. We look at 12th graders, 10th graders, and 8th graders since 1991. We see an increase, just like in adults in the early 90s, then a relative leveling off, although there's a slight dip here in 2005 and 6. But more or less, it looks pretty flat, right? Pretty flat for 12th graders between legalization and 2017. However, in 10th graders, definitely dropping during that time. And then with 8th graders, fairly level, a slight drop these last year or two. So the bottom line is, if you really want to sort of be fair here, I would suggest, that it has really been little change certainly no sharp increases in cannabis use among adolescents after legalization. In adults, there does seem to be a slight uptick in use after legalization. Okay, this is a fascinating statistic for me in terms of our research here. This is looking at the proportion of older Americans using cannabis from 1984 to 2015. And the interesting thing here is, look at since 2010, in this over 60 group, totally spiking, going up almost 4 times, increasing almost 4 times in terms of prevalence of use, right? So very curious to see the 16, 17, and 18 data to see if that increase continues among this older age group. And that, to me, is a fascinating issue in terms of what exactly is going on. Why are more and more older adults, our aging population, why are they using more cannabis? And what is the functional impact? What is the impact of that? Okay, so also there's the Monitoring the Future, looking at past year use. And those findings don't differentiate states with and without legalized recreational cannabis. However, recent work used these same data to examine the possibility that specific states may actually be different than the national trends, right? So here we're going to compare Colorado and Washington with other states. And this is a paper published in JAMA Pediatrics. And so here what we're looking at is Washington, Colorado, and non-recreational marijuana states, right? So again comparing the two rec states to non-legal states. And what you can see here for 8th graders, if anything, maybe Washington saw a slight uptick in use among 8th graders. That was completely flat, though, in Colorado, and slightly decreasing in the non-rec states. And then we look at 10th graders, again, perhaps a slight uptick in Washington, though a downtick in Colorado, and a slight downtick in the non-legal states. And then over here, basically for 12th graders, what you see, again, is a small downtick in Colorado, and basically totally flat for both Washington and the non-legal states. And so it's hard to look at these data also and think that legalization is causing increases in adolescent cannabis use. Okay, so the summary in terms of epidemiology, findings don't really support a nationwide increase in cannabis use since legalization among adolescents, while there may be an increase among adults and certainly among older adults. Changes in states with legalized cannabis haven't been consistent. So Washington may be a slight increase, but maybe some slight decreases in Colorado. A similar study looked at cannabis use in Oregon after legalization, and there was some evidence that cannabis use increased, but only for those who reported heavy alcohol use. So again, it's not there's no clear evidence to suggest that adolescent use is increasing as a result of legalization. So let's talk about risks of addiction. So this is a real risk, but it's actually very important to understand the context of this risk. So this is a big paper with a lot of data, published in 2013, reviewing all studies since 1990, spanning 187 countries. 13 million people met criteria for cannabis dependence, now called cannabis use disorder. Here's the thing. That risk peaks in early adulthood at 2% for females and 4% for males. So that is just not a very big number. And you can see from these graphs, and this is looking again across different regions of the world, that Australia and, where are we? North America, of course. North America and Australia have the highest numbers in terms of cannabis use disorder. And again, that risk peaks right at the early 20s and then drops precipitously as you get older. So this context is very important because if you're talking to a Parkinson's patient who's, 60 years old or 70 years old, there's really very little data to suggest any risk at all in terms of cannabis use disorder. And this is also consistent with those numbers I showed you from the study that my grad student did, looking at people over the age of 60 and showing basically almost, less than one symptom of cannabis use disorder on average. And these people have been using 40 years. So the point here is that, again, and you'll see this, time and time again, the risks are higher for younger people, much lower for older people. Also lower for women. Okay, so now we're looking at disability. So this in many ways mirrors changes in cannabis use disorder, right? We're looking at to what degree is there years lived with disability is what epidemiologists are interested in here. And again, what we see is a peak around the age of lower 20s, much higher in men than women. So not too surprising there. We look at disability across the years, but also across different substances of abuse. And what we see here is that basically, alcohol use causes a substantial amount of disability, almost as much as drug dependence overall. But when we look at the different types, we have basically opioid right here at the top. A very small percentage of that is cocaine. A small percentage is amphetamine. A small percentage is cannabis, right? So of this 53%, a very small amount of that is actually due to cannabis. Okay, so let's talk about other risks, other potential areas of harm. What about the effects of cannabis use on cognition? Many studies have focused on the cognitive effects of cannabis use. So there is clear evidence, and I think anybody who has used cannabis knows that there's the potential for effects on cognition. And the key question here is how long do those effects persist, right? And so there have been some really cool meta-analyses recently. This one published in JAMA by Scott and colleagues recently. They basically did a review of 69 studies of cannabis use and cognitive functioning. You see here the title in case you'd like to Google it and look at it in detail. But basically what they found was cannabis use is in fact associated with decreases in performance on a variety of cognitive tasks. The largest effects are on learning tasks, abstraction tasks, and processing tasks. And you see here the different tasks, and you see the effect size. The biggest effect sizes for these tasks up here, the smallest effect sizes for these tasks down here. But this is very important. Again, the question is, but how long do these effects last? So they did some analyses to determine whether these effects last longer term. And what they found basically was that the cognitive effects went away after 72 hours after the last use, right? So basically, they don't typically last longer than 3 days. And that's important to know. Okay, what about risks in terms of education and educational achievement? Well, cannabis use has been linked to lower levels of educational attainment, at least in some studies. However, those studies often don't take into account other explanations, like pre-existing differences in cognitive functioning that may be due to genetic factors or other variables. When you look at twin studies, they typically have not replicated this association between cannabis use and lower educational attainment. What about the gateway hypothesis? Some of you may remember the gateway hypothesis, which basically suggests that using cannabis directly increases risk for using other illicit drugs. Well, what about the evidence for this? Well, epidemiology research shows increased risk of becoming dependent on alcohol or other illicit drugs if you're using cannabis. It's also been linked to nicotine dependence. However, this sequence of drug use, the idea is that using cannabis is the gateway to other illicit drugs. However, that's just probably part of the process, right? People typically use alcohol and cannabis as being the two drugs that appear to be to them less harmful than the harder drugs. That just makes sense. It doesn't mean that there's anything special about cannabis that leads to use of harder drugs. So anyway, the evidence here is not that strong in terms of a very specific gateway hypothesis. Animal models, however, suggest that THC exposure affects the reward centers of the brain later in life. And the point here is that whether it's alcohol or it's THC, you are in fact potentially changing the functionality of some of these connections in the brain that could potentially put you at some degree of risk if you are using other drugs later in life. Okay, what about psychopathology? So developing other forms of other problems like depression or PTSD or anxiety. The National Academy's report suggested that cannabis use was not a risk factor for depression, PTSD, or anxiety, although might be linked with greater severity of bipolar disorder. And then also early use of cannabis has been associated with development of psychosis or schizophrenia. We're going to talk about this in much greater detail during the module on psychosis. It's not entirely clear whether it's causal or a shared risk factor. And the other fascinating thing here is that the National Academy found that cannabinoids may actually be helpful for people who are already diagnosed with schizophrenia, in particular CBD, which we will also cover in the future module. But bottom line here, definitely an association in the data between cannabis use and psychosis. It's just not entirely clear that cannabis use causes psychosis. But this is an important sign that people should pay attention to, especially those who have a family risk of psychosis. It may also increase the risk for social anxiety, and heavy use has been associated, at least in a couple studies, with increased thoughts of suicide. So in conclusion, adult use may have increased some with legalization, no consistent evidence of increases among adolescents. People over the age of 65 are showing the biggest increases. Risk of cannabis use disorder is small but real, and it's real especially in people in their younger 20s. It is extremely small in people who are age 60 and older, and it does seem to be very much dependent upon age. Acute use has detrimental effects on learning and cognition. as most people know, but this effect dissipates within 72 hours after discontinuing use. Not a lot of evidence to support specifically cannabis as a gateway drug. It is, however, linked with psychosis and may exacerbate bipolar disorder. And clearly the public health message here should be it's not worth the risk if you are young and have a family history of psychosis. Risk of harm is greater, as I mentioned, in young people and people with pre-existing mental health issues.